Welcome to the Lesson of the Week with yours truly, Sean Thunder Wallace. I'm a performer, composer, and professor of music at The Ohio State University. This weekly program is designed to inspire and inform the serious music student. We're all students here, so join me on the path of discovery as we learn together.
The first thing I have my students do is they come in and they show me their practice log. Now, the purpose of the practice log is not for me to be in people's business. It's not even about that. Really what it's about is it's about me having the maximum amount of information so that I can diagnose and give a proper prescription to whatever the ailment is. So like say for instance, if somebody's really struggling with a certain 251 or something, but then I look at their practice log and they tell me that they're practicing, and I can see that they're practicing, but maybe they're only practicing 15 minutes a day or 20 minutes a day on that.
Gotcha.
Then I can say, well, check it out. You don't need to practice this here quite so much. Practice this more, and this is going to help. Because sometimes it's hard to solve your own problem because you're yourself and you can't see yourself from another perspective. And since I'm not God, I'm not in the room with you when you're practicing. So that's kind of the whole purpose of that. Also, I found in my research, because everything for me is research, where I'm basically making guesses and seeing if the stuff actually works or not. And the stuff that works, I keep. The stuff that doesn't work, I throw it away. So that's kind of how it's going. But what I found is with my students, as soon as I implemented practice laws, and in my improvisation class, as soon as I implemented practice laws, I saw a sharp increase in everybody. It didn't matter what level people were at. It was a sharp increase. And I think that I don't think that it was because people just weren't really practicing, and now they had to give me evidence that they were practicing, like in high school or middle school band, the practice cards. It wasn't that kind of stuff. Maybe it was that way for some people, but that wasn't really what it was. I think what it was is that by having to be very specific about what it was that they were spending their time doing, it caused them to get a much more quality out of the practice room time. And the fact is everybody's busy. Everybody has 100,000 things to do. So if I only have, 3 hours, or heck, let's make this even simple. If I only have an hour to practice, or an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours to practice, then what I practice becomes crucial. It becomes absolutely essential what I practice. And so that's kind of what I found with the practice logs. And so it's not my desire to be in your business or anything else. I've just found that when people are being very specific about what it is that they're practicing, and then obviously since we're doing lessons together, be willing to show me that, and so I can see exactly what's happening in the practice room, it puts me in a better position to actually help. And that's all I really want to do is help. I don't really need to know what's going on. I just want to be able to diagnose whatever the issue is and help my students to be able to develop as quickly as possible, but while still enjoying the process. So it's like there's a fine line there. Then the second thing I typically do in lessons, like I will assign 5 tunes per quarter, and the tunes depend on the student. So I try to have tunes that are at the level that the student is at, but that are going to challenge the student. So I'm talking about standards, things out of the jazz standard book, and also out of the American songbook kinds of standards also. And we play. We'll come in here, we play 10 courses, 15 courses, or whatever it is of something. And another reason that I highly encourage my students to record lessons is because oftentimes I'll play something and the student's like, well, what was that?
Right.
Or they go back and they listen to the lesson, which I require people to do during the week at least once, but maybe a couple times. and they're like, oh man, that course he played, oh that was pretty hip. Let me get some of them 2/5s out of it. So then it makes our time together more valuable. I mean, you get more out of it, rather than just trying to kind of remember, oh man, the vibe was cool. Let me try to recapture the vibe. It can be a little more specific than that.
Right.
Okay, so we'll work on tunes, and we'll do 5 tunes every couple weeks. We'll move on to the next tune. We'll come up with a list today of tunes, and this tune can be some of the stuff that's in there, but then it can also be whatever tunes that, like, say you might have a couple of tunes you're like, man, I've always wanted to deal with this, or I wonder what you think about this tune, or what the approach to this tune would be. So that's totally great. Okay. Then the third thing is transcriptions. Now, transcriptions for me, there's two things I'm thinking about. Oftentimes I will assign my students what I call etude transcriptions. In other words, stuff that's already written out, stuff for them to be using their eyes, but also their ears, obviously, because everything I expect them to play with the recording, and make sure that it's exactly as the recording is. But rather than, some teachers, they get into now I'm not trying to dog anybody, but like the Jim Snydero thing. Okay, I got me some Jim Snydero etudes, and my thing is, what would be better? A book of etudes that are trying to simulate a jazz aesthetic, or the actual stuff that he's trying to pull that aesthetic out of? It seems to me that the transcriptions would be better. And so I've got an extensive collection of stuff, and from all time periods. I also want my students to have a rounded experience. So I've got stuff back to like Sidney Bechet, all the way out to the most modern stuff that's out. I've got a ton of stuff. There's a ton of stuff. All kinds of stuff. But then the second thing when I talk about transcriptions is obviously stuff that you're transcribing. Sometimes I will assign somebody to transcribe something right out of the lesson. Maybe a course of this or a couple of courses of that. And but usually that's something that I leave up to the student. So there might be something that you really just have been wanting to deal with, or a certain artist that you've been wanting to deal with. And I usually assign maybe 3 etude transcriptions a quarter and maybe 2 transcriptions a quarter. Things that you're transcribing. Number 4 is 2 5/1s and turnarounds. Now, this is kind of that's kind of a loose category because there's different kinds of turnarounds, there's different kinds of 2 5/1s, and then there's other stuff that specifically is not a turnaround or a 2/5 that we deal with in that category, like giant step substitutions and tritone substitutions. So stuff like that. So that's kind of that whole big thing. Then number 5, patterns and technical. So a lot of times I may assign a pattern or a note group for students to to work out with different intervals, separated by different intervals. So like, say for instance, a very common pattern, well, what would that sound like if it was harmonized with half steps or whole steps, minor thirds, major thirds, fourths, fifths? So it's given obviously some technical stuff you're getting out of that. But then it's probably going to develop some different kinds of patterns and ideas that maybe you didn't think of that are hip. It's like, oh man, I want to use that now. Okay. So, and then obviously dialogue. and obviously we're talking throughout. But I try to give some time for the student every lesson at the end, maybe towards the end or after we've dealt with a lot of stuff. I want people to ask questions. It's most easy for me to do my job if the student comes with a list of questions.